Hi Supercharger. So in this lesson we're gonna go over the basics of hue, saturation, and brightness inside of Figma. If you're not familiar with it, Figma is a design tool. It's kind of the most popular UI design tool on the market, and for a reason. There's a ton of benefits for using it. But honestly, if you've ever used any kind of a design tool, everything that I'm going to share is still going to be applicable and kind of useful to you. And also, if you do want to dive in deeper into Figma and kind of become a more advanced user, we have a beginner Figma course and an advanced Figma video course that you can check out and kind of get to that point even outside of this course. But when it comes to everything that you're going to need for this course, don't worry. Even if you're not a pro user, and even if you're going to be using a different design tool, you can still really easily follow along, so don't worry. And if you do decide to use Figma and kind of get your first experience with it because of this course, I am going to actually walk you through everything that's going to be needed about color and how to use it in Figma in one of the upcoming videos, so don't worry about it. Okay, so we got that out of the way and we can really focus on the hue, saturation, and brightness aspect of it. So, as you can see in here, we have three colored circles. One of them is red, the other one is green, and the third one is blue. And all of those three things are connected to hue. A hue, as you already learned, is where the color is on the color wheel. And if you envision an imaginary circle, basically, or like a wheel, that color wheel goes from 0 to 360. And all of the colors that we can kind of perceive are going to be somewhere on that color wheel represented by an angle. So 0 and 360 are going to be red, 120 is going to be the green area, 240 is going to be the blue area, and everything in between is going to be filled with all of the other colors. So you can see that represented in here. In most, again, design tools, you're going to find something similar to this. The only important thing to stress is maybe your settings by default are set to hex or like RGB or some other color model. For design purposes, we're going to be using HSB a lot, so switch it to HSB. I'm going to explain why again in one of the upcoming videos, so don't worry about it for now. But if you switch it to HSB, you're going to see that there are three input fields in here and the percentage of like how transparent the color is. And that's it. So we have in here the hue going from 0 to 360 degrees, as you can see in here. As I'm sliding towards the right side of the color wheel, the number in here changes from 0 to 360. The fourth part in here is this opacity that I mentioned, like that's how transparent something is, but we're not going to be touching upon that for now. And so we're only going to be worrying about the first three fields. First one being the hue, H, saturation, S, and the third one, brightness, B. So the same way that they are represented in here, HSB is represented in here as well. The first number, the second number, and the third number being for brightness. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. The other thing in here that you can see is that we have a really nice color space for that hue that is set in here, that we can kind of move this to left, right, top, bottom, wherever we want to, and it's going to impact the other two values. So it's going to impact the saturation and brightness. For hue, what's really important is for you to know that it moves from 0 to 360, and that number then represents what color we perceive. So it's going to move from like reds to oranges to yellow tones to really light green ones, and then kind of more bluish green ones and cyan ones, to light blues, dark blues, purple, pink, and then back to red. Okay, so we covered that part. The next part that I do want to show you about hue particularly is how we can use it to our advantage when it comes to areas like this, where you have something that you want to be represented in red, but you feel like this is like too much for a user to actually look at. So one thing that you can do is you can go in here into the hue input field and enter something in the ranges of like maybe up to 10. So like something in between like 5 to 10 is a really good area where you're not really gonna change how we call that color or that hue, but it is gonna change how we're impacted by it. So if you're seeing here, the more degrees that I move from 0 to 360, I'm going to be moving closer to orange. So if I want this message to still feel very warm, but not be as vividly red as this one is, I can just kind of shift it slightly towards orange, and we're still going to call this red, but you see how differently it feels from the example on the top. And you can also do the same thing in here, but let's do it, like this. So if you think of 0 and 360 as being like the red, the reddest red there is, moving it more towards 350 means that we're moving more towards pinkish tones. And you can see in here that this message now is still vivid, but it's not like really screaming red to me. It has that little hint of something else. It has a hint of pink, and therefore it feels a little bit different. So you can use hue to your advantage to get a different feeling from our users as you're playing around with it. Okay. Now moving to saturation, you can see that the saturation is basically how vivid or like strong that color is versus how dull it feels. One extreme of saturation is no saturation at all, and that's always going to end in gray. It doesn't matter what hue it is, and you can check on that in here. Basically, if we set this to 0 or to 120 or to 240 or to 360, nothing really happens with this color. So like if there is no saturation, the hue is not going to be seen. And you can really see it in here, that as soon as I kind of close this color picker and go back in here, it kind of resets it to 0 just because there's nothing there. There's no hue, and there's no saturation. So it kind of immediately sets it back to the default gray, which is always going to be on the red part. So just something to keep in mind, like if you have hue at 1 and its saturation at 1, even if you close it off, it's still going to kind of remember that part. But as soon as you put it to 0, it's going to reset it to the kind of default gray that we have in design software. But yeah, basically, if there is no saturation present, we're always going to get the same shade of gray if the brightness is set to a particular number, irrelevant of what hue we have. So it's just something to keep in mind. Saturation is going to be represented by this middle number, and you can move the saturation from 0 to 100. So 100 would be like the most saturated version of this color. One important thing to note when you're thinking about saturation for UI design is it's usually good to kind of avoid this area in here on top. Like how small or big you're gonna go, it depends on the project, but usually these areas are so saturated, they're really hard on the eyes, and if there's a lot of those colors on your screen, the user is gonna be overwhelmed and kind of, it's not gonna look as professional as it would if you're using kind of this less saturated area. So it's really just good to avoid having saturation somewhere above like 90-ish. Again, not the same for all of the hues. There are little subtle differences there as well. But like a rule of thumb is if you're avoiding the area of saturation that's around like 90 plus, that's going to be good for you. Okay, I don't think there's anything else really important about saturation. The only other thing is if you change the saturation in here, so like this, you can see that basically the only thing that happens with this shade that's selected is that it's moving from left to right. So the more right you are in this area of the color picker, the more vivid or saturated your color is going to appear, and the more on the left you are, you're getting closer and closer to grays. One important thing about the color picker in here is you can see that basically everything on the bottom is black, but everything on the top is not white. And that means that the saturation in here only moves from left to right and brightness only moves from top to bottom. And you can get to black irrelevant of what saturation it is and what hue it is. But if you want to get to white, saturation has to be set to 0. And that kind of creates a little weird effect, because with hue, saturation, and brightness, you're not going to be thinking about like, oh, adding black is the same as removing white. That's not kind of true, even though logically for us it would seem true. And I'm going to talk more about this topic and like what happens and why it happens. But I just wanted to kind of draw your attention to it, because you can now really see it visually, that like everything in here, when brightness is going to be set to 0, is going to be black, irrelevant of what hue you set or what saturation you set. Versus if you set saturation to like 20 and put brightness to 100, and let's just do that, so like something like this, it's gonna appear green still, as long as there's saturation. Everything besides like 0 is gonna have a hint of green inside of it, and even if the brightness is set to 100. So think of it as like a light bulb that has a color on it, and no matter how much you effort and like strength you put into that light to become brighter and brighter, it's never going to remove that feeling of green in it. But if you like close it off and turn it off, you're gonna get it to be black. Okay. Now we did talk about brightness a little bit, and this is basically showing you what I meant by it. So you can see in here we have black, and all of the shades of brightness are now higher and higher. So in here we had 0, in here it's 25, in here it's going to be 50. Everything else is the same, so like hue and saturation are going to be the same in all of them. The only thing that's changed is brightness. And the more and more you get to the brighter parts of this design, you're going to see that it basically lights up that blue hue that we have at 240. Alternatively, if we remove saturation, we're gonna have shades of gray that are slowly approaching white. And these two colors both have brightness set to 100. But you can also see that this one appears really white and bright, and this one, like, it does appear bright, but because it's a shade of dark blue, we kind of consider it darker compared to pure white. And you can see the same effect in here. So if I go in here, the hue is 240, so like difference is going to be in here. The hues are going to be different, but saturation and brightness, in here we have 80 and we have 75 in here. In here, all of those are 0, but this is still 75. So like both of these are the same brightness, but they're not the same kind of perceived lightness that we have in here. So it's going to be really important when you're thinking about UI design, because colors have associated like brightness feel to them, but we don't control it with the brightness setting that we have in HSB. So just keep it in mind that if you're working with less saturated colors, because they don't have that saturation aspect of it, they might appear brighter and brighter. Okay, so we covered all three of those things. The only other thing that I want to do with you is a little exercise, if you don't mind. And let's first look at this first shade of color that we have in here and try to guess the hue, saturation, and brightness from it. You don't have to be correct. This is your first time doing it. Don't worry about it. But just like think about it for a second. Think about like what, if we think about these three aspects of color, what values might this be? So in here, what I see a shade of like orangish yellow. And I do know that yellow is at 60 degrees and that red is at 0 degrees. Kind of the middle part is really orange at 30. So I feel like this is more closer to like probably 50 when it comes to hue. Saturation, it does seem to be saturated, but I'm not sure if it's like too much further from like 60, 70 saturation, because it does have that color in it, but still feels a little bit pastel. And then finally, when it comes to brightness, it does seem really bright. So I am going to go with something like hue of 50, saturation of maybe like 65, and brightness of like 80. Okay, so 40, not too far away. 65 was like really there. And okay, it's even brighter than I expected at like 93. It's just like a fun way to analyze and think about color as you're going to be thinking about it as a designer, because you really do need to kind of nail down the hue, saturation, and brightness aspect of a color. Now, one other thing to keep in mind is like, even if you did it like fully wrong, don't worry. Just something that you should be kind of practicing with time, is that you start to kind of analyze and figure out all of these values and try to identify it. You don't have to be perfect, but it's going to be really helpful for you if you can do it, because that means that you're really understanding how colors work for UI design purposes. So let's do the same thing in here for this kind of purplish shade. I do feel like it's somewhere in the middle of when it comes to saturation. So I'm even going to slightly put it to the left. So somewhere around 40. Brightness, again, maybe like 70. So we have 40 and 70 for saturation and brightness. And hue, I think it's going to be around 240. Okay, 230, not too far away. 40-ish, perfect. And here it's like 60. So like, again, not fully perfect, but you can see that, like, as I was explaining my thought process, you can really understand how I'm analyzing color from the purpose of like HSB. This one feels like a really saturated dark tone. So I do feel like brightness is probably going to be lower, around like 20. Saturation is going to be really high, maybe like 90 even. And since it is kind of purplish, I do feel like it's probably going to be in like 310 maybe. Okay, 300, cool. 85, not too far away from 90. And this one is 20. I don't remember like was it 30 or 20 or whatever I said, but like overall, I was again really close to it. So that means that with time, I managed to kind of really understand the hue, saturation, and brightness part of color. Not something that you're going to be directly asked to do, but honestly, trust me, if you manage to kind of build this skill with time to really, really understand where hue, saturation, and brightness are and how they play around with each other, because I wouldn't give the same answer if we were working with like a really saturated and less bright tone of yellow, just because like yellow also has some kind of a perceived brightness to it as well. So there is a lot of factors to consider, but as you're moving further and further with the lessons in this course, try to kind of grasp everything that we're doing and why it makes sense and why it makes a color work in a particular way. So yeah, that's all when it comes to like demoing hue, saturation, and brightness. I hope that this lesson helped you kind of see things in action, and that it's going to help you further understand some of the topics that I'm going to go over in the next few videos. Thank you for following along.